Claiming Usefulness, being presented by Mr. Andrew Bloch, PhD student at Concordia Seminary. Here in his master's degree from Concordia Seminary, his current research centers on the distinction of the two wills in Christ, according to Maximus the Confessor. He is also, recently, Humanities and Latin teacher at Trinity Academy here at Concordia University. Please welcome Mr.
Thank you for the introduction. I have some handouts here at the front. If we could pass those around. I do not have that many for all of you, but thank you for coming. So if you're a couple, if you could please share, that'd be great. When will I ever use this? I am assuming that most of you here have heard that question at least once in your lifetime. Perhaps some of you have even asked this question when you were younger students. It's one of the age-old debates of educational philosophy. To state it as a proposition, this critique of education states the following. Education, at its core, equips a person with necessary knowledge and skills. As a teacher and student, I have heard a form of this question in many disciplines, including math, science, history, literature, philosophy, and Latin. But for such a wide-ranging, popular critique, I have noticed that teachers sometimes struggle to give an answer for why they do what they do. At other times, I have heard answers which arise from frustration or exhaustion, understandably so. Even more, I have heard other answers that show a suspicion of anything progressive or modern, as if hiding in the past is a good enough answer to living in the present. Classical education is a reaction against contemporary educational models. At its core, classical education is a retrieval of values and methods of the past, with a critical appropriation in the present. However, sometimes this reactionary stance can work against classical education. It makes us give up on values and goals which we need not forfeit. One example that I see is the usefulness of education. I have encountered a view of classical education which seems to take pride in the fact that it's not useful. Teaching a dead language like Latin is good because it builds character, or because we have done it for so long of a time in the West. These reasons are not only unconvincing, but they betray the character of classical education as useful. It is true that classical education and more progressively bent educational models have different definitions of usefulness and different goals and strategies to reach those goals. But I would hope that you agree with me when I say that Lutheran classical education should not give up the idea that education at its core is useful for a student. It's my hope that this presentation will be useful to you as you think through why you do what you do. So to begin to answer the question of the usefulness of education, it's good to define what we mean by useful. The term comes from Latin utor, which most often means to use. However, this most straightforward definition, which would probably earn you a point on a test or quiz, does not quite capture the word for the original Latin speakers. Often a translation of this word, which I find works well, albeit clunkily in English, is to make use of something to the user's advantage. This broadens the range of that word, useful. I hope you will indulge me as I dive deeper into this word, utor. the meaning of this word is drastically different from the English use today. Cicero uses this word to explain the cultural benefits of a toga. You make use of the privileges of being a consul by wearing that toga and using that status to your advantage. Another way this word can be employed is to describe the function of taking a medicine. You use the medicine to your advantage. However, it can also have a negative sense of indulging the passions. You make use of anger when you act in violence upon it. Finally, in a transferred sense, utor can mean to enjoy someone's companionship and friendship. You use that person. You take advantage of the friendship by enjoying time spent together. Now, this final example, which I just gave, shows the deep rift that has formed between the Latin utor and our word use. Today, using another person is a cultural sin. To use someone often connotes using them to your own selfish advantage, often in the worst way possible. A friend might use you for your money, your status, or beauty. This goes against the moral philosopher Kant's very definition of human ethical behavior. He taught that one ought never to treat a person as a means to an end, but as an end in herself. I suspect that it is this semantic confusion that makes Augustine, who will become now the focus of our contemplation together, so strange when he speaks of things to be used and things to be enjoyed in De Doctrina Christiana. Augustine wrote this work on Christian preaching and teaching to assist pastors and teachers as they expound upon the Scriptures. He begins this four-part work in Book 1 with a dichotomy of things to be used and things to be enjoyed, which are gerundives for those Latin people in here, of fruor and utor, respectively. Now, the undergirding metaphor that Augustine pairs with this dichotomy to illustrate his idea is a pilgrimage. Someone's goal is to make it to the destination and enjoy it. However, like some of the travelers in the Pilgrim's Progress, sometimes we turn to enjoy things on the journey more than the end of the journey itself. In fact, it seems that today, in our culture, enjoying the journey is more important than reaching the destination as a general rule. Therefore, Augustine stresses that the goal of the journey should be enjoyed, and everything along the way should be used. But Augustine expands this metaphor into two categories of things in the entire universe. There are then, to Augustine, things to be used and things to be enjoyed. But luckily for us, the list of things to be enjoyed is short. God, and God alone. Since these things belong to two categories, the other category, unsurprisingly, is very easy as well. Augustine places everything else in the universe in the category of things to be used. But immediately he faces a problem. How can he speak of using our neighbors, or even using ourselves, rather than enjoying ourselves? After all, everything on this journey must be used to make it to our destination of enjoyment in God's vision. For his own purposes, Augustine defines using, later on in this book, as loving something or someone for another's sake. This is contrasted with loving God, and he should be loved for his own sake. And Augustine even says that we should not love ourselves for our own sake, but for God's. As you can imagine, this is a difficult position to hold. It sounds striking to hear that we should only use things and not enjoy them. It is as if we have a wonderful feast to enjoy, and we are reminded that we should only use this food for nourishment, and that we should not enjoy it because that would be sinful. But part of this difficulty is the difference semantically between that English to use and the Latin utor that I spoke of earlier. But even for Augustine, it appears that this distinction was stretched for him at best. Augustinian scholarship is not only divided on how to interpret this dichotomy of things, much like they are divided on the rest of his works, but they point out that Augustine himself did not even defend this dichotomy in his later works. Augustine never brings it up when he speaks of the ordo amoris, or the order of love, and how we ought to order the things which we love, although of course he places God at the top of his hierarchy. But notably again, Augustine gives up his earlier dichotomy of things to be enjoyed and things to be used, which he made in De Doctrina Christiana years later in his later works. It's my position that we could critically retrieve this dichotomy and broaden it beyond Augustine's original onto-theological project. This dichotomy is useful for discussions about education, but we should further define what exactly we mean by use and enjoy. In today's world, usefulness is almost always related to two aspects of our lives, at least in God's left-hand kingdom. First, a knowledge is useful if it is employed at work. To use an example of Latin, learning Latin is useful for a person who is going into the medical profession, because many Latin roots are used in medicine. But second, a knowledge is useful when it is employed in being a citizen or a consumer. Latin is not incredibly useful in this category, except perhaps to read the Latin phrases on the coins as we make our purchases. Enjoyment, or to enjoy in our cultural situation, typically means pure, often mindless, entertainment, or what happens when we're not at work. But to shed more light on the usefulness of Latin, it may be helpful to ask the following question. What happens if we employ this dichotomy of things to be used and things to be enjoyed in God's right-hand kingdom? How is knowledge to be used in God's church? We can see right away that this dichotomy appears to break down. There are not tasks which we must do in this kingdom that we could classify as work, except perhaps to trust God's promises and love our neighbors. Our work, then, becomes sharing God's good word for the world with everyone. But perhaps also this is where usefulness comes in handy. For example, it is useful to know how to read the biblical text. But what about enjoyment in God's right-hand kingdom? Is that entertainment? I believe there's a way to save enjoyment in God's right-hand kingdom. We are enjoying ourselves when we worship together and receive God's gifts. I am drawing here upon Joseph Pieper's definition of leisure, or schole. This happens, as Pieper writes, when we look beyond the limits of our social and functional station to contemplate and celebrate the world as such, to become and to be that person who is essentially oriented towards the whole of reality. In the Word and sacraments, we taste, hear, touch God's favor towards us. We could rightly say that we both use the sacraments as sinners in need of forgiveness. But we also enjoy and delight in the Word as it defines who we truly are as God's forgiven children. Perhaps this is why I've never heard someone ask in a theology course, when will I ever use this? But perhaps they have for you. That critique is seemingly off limits here. Theological knowledge is useful for your pilgrimage towards God in service to your neighbor. In fact, it's a matter of life and death, the most useful knowledge there is. But theological knowledge is also something to be contemplated and enjoyed in that way. When When we think on God's order in creation or pray the Psalms, we are truly enjoying ourselves, the world, and God himself, in the fullest sense of that word possible. It's my contention that in our day, enjoyment needs saving in God's left-hand kingdom. Usefulness we can understand, and there are good reasons for adopting a classical model as being more useful than a more progressively oriented model of education. Education should prepare students for an active work life. This is a statement no one argues over. However, the more contentious argument is that education ought to prepare students to be enjoyers of the world. Surprisingly, education is useful in that it prepares students to have enjoyment. Today, there's hardly a division between work, entertainment, and what I will call enjoyment, but what Joseph Pieper calls leisure. More simply, for us, there is work and non-work entertainment. This is the attitude of working for the weekend. We finally get to relax at the end of our work. And yet, even there, as Pieper points out, we would much rather turn our entertainment into work than explore the possibility of enjoying ourselves. We work on our tennis game or golf game. We work on becoming better at our hobbies. We have no time to enjoy God's good world. Classical Lutheran education prepares students to be useful workers and citizens, and also prepares them to be enjoyers of God's good world. This second part is what is critically important as we prepare students to be citizens of God's left-hand kingdom. Students become attuned to good, beautiful, and true language when they encounter the great books. They discover the great ideas of the world, useful for any citizen. As they learn the truth of God's good word for the world, they become grounded in God's law for the world and his promise of salvation in Jesus Christ. All these skills are instrumental in preparing students to be people who are God's children in the right-hand kingdom and simultaneously citizens in a particular place in God's left-hand kingdom. The problem of most modern education's pragmatic bent is that it is an utor without a fruor. It is use without enjoyment. When we Christian educators are honest about our ultimate goals, which we earnestly believe to be the ultimate goals for a student's education, we reap as helpful byproducts these useful skills that have no possibility of enjoyment. Returning to Latin for my examples, common purely pragmatic reasons people often give for studying Latin include the following: easier foreign language acquisition, better SAT scores, AP college credit, and understanding of grammar by teaching an inflected language. Even here, all those examples are useful, but not ends in themselves. Here's an example of how teaching Latin attunes students to be enjoyers beyond users. Latin is a beautiful language worth learning with a rich cultural history. Wonderfully true and good things have been written about God and the world in the Latin language. And beautiful works, such as Virgil's Aeneid, can be enjoyed even more when one has a knowledge of Latin. By morally and aesthetically attuning students through the Latin language, we make them better citizens of both kingdoms. We teach them to love and enjoy God's good gifts of language and the beauty inherent in it. We teach them useful knowledge of world history and the great conversation. We even invite them to understand the ancient and medieval mind a little bit better when we teach them Latin. Learning Latin then becomes transformed from a means to achieve a standardized test score into a means to make good citizens of God's kingdoms. This education creates citizens who not only work and participate in public life with greater purpose, but who also know how to enjoy God's good world. Augustine himself might abhor what I have done to his clean dichotomy. To him, what I am saying would amount to nothing less than idolatry. To enjoy something that is not God is to not fear, love, and trust in God above all things, for Augustine. As Lutherans, though, we do believe that God has created a good world. Who are we to declare unclean what God has made clean? Lutherans with Luther believe that God still provides for us in both kingdoms. One only need to read Luther's large catechism on the Creed to see this. So when we enjoy the world for the good, true, and beautiful things within it, or the good, true, and beautiful within human art, we are thanking God for the things which he has created. To use another metaphor of Augustine's, we are plundering the Egyptians when we take and enjoy or use the good things made by evil men. These good things are really, after all, the property of God's kingdoms. However, Augustine's charge of idolatry should not be brushed away so quickly. To help illustrate this charge, I will read to you one of the most colorful and thought-provoking passages by Augustine's frenemy, Jerome. In letter 22, Jerome recalls his early time as a monk and an illness which almost led to his death. Jerome writes in paragraph 30 in the Nicene Fathers series, "Many years ago, when for the kingdom of heaven's sake I had cut myself off from home, and when I was on my way to Jerusalem to wage my warfare, I still could not bring myself to forego the library which I had formed for myself at Rome, with great care and toil. And so, miserable man that I was, I would fast, only that I might afterwards read Cicero. After many nights spent in vigil, after floods of tears called from my inmost heart, after the recollection of my past sins, I would once more take up Plautus. And when at times I returned to my right mind and read the prophets, their style seemed rude and repellent. I failed to see the light with my blinded eyes, but I attributed the fault not to them, but to the sun. Suddenly, when the old serpent was making me his plaything, a deep-seated fever fell upon my weakened body. I was caught up in the spirit and dragged before the judgment seat of the judge. Asked who or what I was, I replied, I am a Christian. But he who presided said, you lie. You are a follower of Cicero and not of Christ. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Jerome writes, instantly I became dumb, and amid the strokes of the lash, for he had ordered me to be scourged, I was tortured far more severely still by the fire of my conscience. In the grave, who shall give you thanks? Jerome recounts the agony of his conscience that has befallen him, and he makes an oath to never again read pagan literature. He said that he would read the books of God with a greater zeal than he had previously given the books of men. Now you may choose to believe or not believe whether Jerome's vision was a figment of his fevered mind or not. But this story shows the danger that God's good world poses to sinners like us. Attuning students to the true, good, and beautiful world as a thing to be used and enjoyed carries with it the danger of making idolaters. Classical Lutheran education always has this balance to keep. We must educate our children in the fullest way possible for them to become good citizens of both kingdoms. Citizens who know why and how to work, when to relax and be entertained, but importantly, how and why to to enjoy the good, true, and beautiful. And yet, as with every good, true, and beautiful thing, it may be enjoyed in itself, and yet for God's sake ultimately, as Augustine reminds us. With such a large task, classical Lutheran educators can both be excited and a bit nervous as they continue to educate the students entrusted to their care. To summarize, classical Lutheran education is useful in 3 ways. One is that it does equip students with useful knowledge and skills to be a good citizen and consumer in God's left-hand kingdom. Secondly, since it is grounded in the truth of God's word, students learn to become citizens in God's right-hand kingdom through classical Lutheran education. But thirdly, classical Lutheran education is useful in that it teaches students to become enjoyers and seekers after the good, true, and beautiful in God's word. It is that category which I believe we could all find better ways to express ourselves to people as they look for a school within which to educate their children. Why do you teach your subject? How do you prepare citizens of both kingdoms? It's my hope that as you seek to provide reasons for the things that you do, that you see the subjects as useful tools, and perhaps also as things that students can also enjoy in some way as they live their life for God and their neighbor. Thank you. So I've left some time for questions, and then I also had a very short handout just with questions of my own for you. But first, are there any questions about my presentation or any points that you'd like me to clarify? Yes, please.
Thank you for this. I was just reading Augustine's on Christian doctrine just a week or so ago.
Oh, yeah.
One thing that, well, I'm not finished with it yet, but one thing I was reading that struck me that you're maybe helping me clarify is his comments on marriage. And so he draws that distinction between using and enjoying a wife.
And today, I mean, if you said, like, I use my wife, you'd probably get locked up or something, right? I mean, yeah, it's so foreign to us, right? Yeah.
So I just wanted to, so maybe help me understand this. So he says, I look with greater approval on the man who uses the fruitfulness of many wives for the sake of an ulterior object, than on the man who enjoys the body of one wife for his own sake.
Yes, yes. So he's using an argument of polygamy, that a good polygamist is better than a bad monogamist. Is what he's saying there, right? So what he's saying is you love your wife, right? And you're using her in that you're loving her because she's God's creation. So you notice how he's putting everything to that theological level where today it's just kind of foreign to how we think. Yeah, it's good. Any other clarification? Yes, please.
Going back to something you had said, I'm not as familiar with the Augustine corpus as you are, but you had said this distinction he makes drops out. I wish I had the city of God with me, but I thought he used this distinction still at a couple of places within the city of God. He doesn't develop it, but in talking about, before he talks about the intersection of the cities, when he's just kind of paralleling them.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if it was in part 1 or part 2. I thought he brought
does.
it up,
Yes.
but didn't develop it.
Yes, and that's kind of people's point. The scholar I'm referring to is Oliver O'Donovan.
Okay.
He's wrote a lot on Augustine. I believe he has a paper even on utor fruor and just how Augustine develops that. But he points out that in City of God, he does bring this up, but he's altered it a little bit. And so it continues to be altered until it finally drops out when he talks about the order of the loves for the human being. So yeah, it definitely pops up, and some of his things from Doctrina Christiana pop up, but they're not given that much attention. I mean, book 1 is like all utor fruor of Doctrina Christiana.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I have a lot of thoughts going on especially with teenagers, being one myself at one time. You know, a lot of times the world, it just stops at the end of my nose, right? And we look at, I guess, what's useful and enjoyable for myself, but how do we get students to look out and see the value and enjoyment and things outside of that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I think this has to do with, I talked about at the beginning, how do we get students to, look outside of themselves, I suppose, because I guess original sin likes to look at ourselves, right? That's what we like to do in our sinful nature. But yeah, I guess exposing them to the great books, but the great conversations that happen with other people, but also enjoying God's creation is great, right? I mentioned that feast example, and that's I think that's the best example of when you're enjoying yourself with a feast, right? Yes, it is work to put it on, but it's not quite mindless entertainment, right? It's something a little deeper is happening there. This is where Joseph Pieper calls it leisure, right? And so it's exposing students to situations where they're able to be enjoyers of the world, right? Exactly how that happens, I'm sorry, I don't really have a pragmatic, here's how you tune students to do that, but just kind of the theory behind it would be tuning them to be enjoyers, but how you do that, that's a whole other question, I suppose. Was that helpful or not, or just?
No, yeah.
Okay.
Gonna keep on.
Yeah, of course. Anything else? If not, I have questions for you. So my paper is based upon this premise. So I'm just going to ask you, is this something that I've made up, basically? So do you agree with me? Sometimes classical Lutheran education has this unspoken fear of being too useful, too pragmatic. If so, why do you think that is? And if not, good. I'm glad it's just me. That means we're distinguishing two kingdoms. So, yeah.
I think we have a tendency to be so reductionistic in our culture that when we look at education and the skills that are taught, that if we can't equate that to our particular job to make particular money for our particular family, then we don't see it as useful.
Right.
And I think you did hit the nail on the head with outlining that we have reduced this definition, as we've reduced almost every other definition. And because of that, you have to reclaim the definition to reclaim what it means to be useful.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you. I'm glad I'm not alone. That's good. That's good to hear.
We'll get T-shirts made.
Yeah.
I'm with him.
Good. Yes.
Go ahead. So we're trying to start a classical Lutheran school with our church, and one of the first, criticisms that we got with the classical methodology is that it doesn't allow for creativity. It's rote memorization. It's, people are picturing Catholic nuns, even though we're Lutheran. But, it's just this idea that children aren't allowed to express themselves because there's uniforms or a dress code, or they're doing copy work. They're not, creating something themselves. And so trying to explain and kind of break down that stereotype that it is fun. It actually fosters creativity and allows for creativity. It's been a challenge.
Yeah. It's much, I would say it's much easier to be creative when you have these great things that you know. So, for example, mimesis is imitation is how it often gets translated, but that's not quite right. In fact, I think there's a talk in the CCLE this year on that subject, which is once you know what's good, true, and beautiful, or you've been exposed to great works of poetry, great works of art, anything like that, you're going to be able to be more creative because you have a sense, you're attuned to what is great, right? And that actually allows you to be more creative because you have a lot of stuff to draw on. That's kind of the argument that I go to with the creativity point. I've heard that one myself. So you know good things, or you've experienced beautiful things, it helps you to write well and to make great creative works of art. So, yeah.
Good artists imitate, great artists steal.
Yeah, there you go. That's good.
I had a thought with that question, and I'm relatively new to the classical education. I just did 1 year in it, but I've been teaching in Lutheran schools for 11 years.
Yeah.
And I actually found non-classical Lutheran education so focused on the pragmatic. I thought, our goal is to prepare them for high school, prepare them for college, and I just, even though our goal ultimately is Christ, it still felt so distracted by the imminent. Whereas when I've been teaching in a classical school, I just find so much more fun and enjoyment in what I'm teaching with my students.
Yeah, it's good. It's good that you brought up enjoyment, though, right? Because we've kind of cut that out of education. I'm arguing that it's useful to be an enjoyer, right? And so, yeah, I think that's a really important thing that classical education brings. That enjoyment. There's a sense of peace. There's a sense of purpose, too, right? When you're
Beyond
studying.
making money as an adult.
Exactly, exactly. So, yeah, you can ground them in God's truth, which includes, His left-hand kingdom in the world, His law for the world, right? So, good. Yes.
I don't know if this is the right place to ask this question.
Oh, no. Okay.
One of the criticisms I've heard of the classical method is it's geared toward people who aren't trained to be educators. So it's for like the homeschool mom. Exactly. So what would be a good argument for that? Because I'm fairly new as well.
Okay. Yeah, I've only been in classical education 3 or 4 years myself, so I'm new too. My wife converted me, if you want to use it. Let's see, could you restate your question one more time, just so I know that I have the right, your question.
Classical education is not for a trained educator. It's for people who are like a homeschool mom, doesn't know how to teach.
So yeah. I mean, I would say what they're doing is they're taking that definition of education, which is you get useful knowledge and skills for the workplace, and they're saying that classical education, since you don't do that all the way, right? You've got this enjoyment thing. Well, what's that useful for, right? That they're kind of taking that and saying, well, yeah, you don't really know what it's like to be a true educator, which is purely pragmatic skills and knowledge. So so I would say it's not just for a select few. I truly believe that classical education is for all in many different particular places. Yes, do you have an answer for this? Yes, please.
I don't know if I have an answer.
Yeah, okay.
One of the successes I've had with people pushing back in that regard is I will ask them, well, is it more important to know deeply what you're attempting to teach someone or simply know how to teach? And that starts a conversation to where if we get to the teacher only knowing the surface of the subjects that they're teaching because they spent so much time on how to teach, then the student will only get a fraction of the surface knowledge that they have. Whereas if I have someone that has a degree in classical literature and not necessarily how to teach it, they'll figure out how to teach it over time. But what they will be able to deliver those students will be much deeper than the surface area. For all of you education majors that aren't classical, I'm not trying to step on toes, but this is how I encounter or push back against that exact thing.
Yeah, that's good.
I think we've been educated by a societal norm.
Yeah, right.
That has brought about a government telling you the proper way to educate versus looking at the right-hand kingdom
Yes.
stuff. And so when you get clouded by left-hand kingdom propaganda,
Yeah, sure.
it's hard to teach people the thinking differently.
Yes, that's right. The left hand has kind of overstepped. I would almost say that we can reclaim some of that left-hand kingdom stuff too, right? Dr. Beath was kind of talking about this in the first session, that it's God's kingdom still in the left hand, right? And so being an enjoyer of the world, and not just God, but the things He's created, in my opinion, is a way to be a good citizen of the world or citizen in a particular place, right? So that's good. That's good. Well, if you can look through these questions, and if you have any other thoughts, or if you have answers that you think are really nice and you'd like to share, I'd love to hear them as well. Yes, way in there.
I'll just throw out the pushback we got from neighbors when we moved to our location and went from homeschool. And I was a teacher, I did public school and private in my field, but not classical. Their argument was, why would you pay so much for, doing this kind of school when our public schools are rated so highly, and, it's more convenient for you to go down the street and do that.
Right, right.
Well, we always pointed back, and they're Christian too, and we said,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
it's the emphasis in Christ, it's the freedom to teach Christ, emphasize Christ every day in the classroom.
That's right.
No amount of money can take that away.
Yes,
so.
yes. That's a very good point. We keep Christ at the center. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of times there winds up being this sort of very strict breakdown between, like progressive education is teaching students what to think and how to do, versus a classical education teaching students how to think and what to do. And I think sometimes there's this tendency when you would be getting into, deeper subject matter that may become useful in its own end, that you wind up getting too close where you're betraying that sort of, dichotomy that you first laid out.
Right.
Right? And so that, and where I want to be most sensitive to this is a lot of times in the sciences, where it's like, well, especially with my own kids who are younger at this current age, a lot of the science we do is much more of the observational aspects of things from a classical approach. Whereas in my mind, I'm sitting there going, but I've got to teach them like the different organelles in a cell. I've got to teach them, like how acid base works and all these sorts of things. These are these useful things because these are going to be the building blocks when they wind up getting the deeper dive into these things later on. And potentially if they like me wind up pursuing a career in the scientific field, the early that sort of belief that the more exposure you have to that early on, the deeper you're able to go each step. And I think sometimes there's a hesitancy that if we start doing that we're sort of betraying our fundamental belief that what we're really teaching is how to think.
Yeah, right. So, I've kind of addressed that fear of, I think you're illustrating that fear of being too pragmatic, right? And teaching the parts of the cell or these other useful bits of information, right? What I also don't want to see happen would be usefulness is only enjoyment and that's it. And how dare you teach them, actually useful things by the world's standards. So I want to bring that in that, yes, being useful means that, you know how to balance a checkbook. That's the pragmatic one where I remember going through school being like, why am I balancing a checkbook in my history class? I can't figure that one out. But like that kind of practical knowledge, but then also enjoying things, right? So I want to keep that usefulness as kind of two sides of a similar thing, I suppose. But that sometimes we fear if we teach them too useful of things that we're somehow betraying classical education. I don't think that's the case either. So I'd say don't be too worried about teaching them things either with the cells.
Yes? I think this dichotomy is closely related to what Dr. Boyle was saying this morning. We have love for God and love for the neighbor, or faith in God and love for the neighbor. You've got this enjoyment of creation and the truth that God has in the world, but you also can't neglect the, pragmatic usefulness to the neighbor. We're serving our neighbors in practical ways. So.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's well said. Yes?
I could use some help from the group, how to respond to a student who questions about the usefulness of Latin.
Why am I using that?
Yes. So if anybody has any thoughts now or later.
Because nobody remembers their 2 years of high school French or Spanish on it.
Yeah, that's one way you could take it, yeah. I mean, I took 3 years. Spanish teacher, I remember it. Yeah, so that's one, is that this approach teaches you things. But here, we have another one.
Sometimes I take a simple English word, peninsula. In Latin, pan is almost, peninsula is island, it's almost an island. And it catches the kids then because they realize the connection between the two.
Yes, I'll embarrass myself. I recently realized that Mediterranean. I finally made that. Yeah, I could have used Latin earlier. Yeah. You're a Latin teacher.
Yeah, Dr. Kopp, who's going to be speaking in a couple sessions in his book, The Devil Speaks Latin,
Oh, great.
talks about how that it's the Latin words that hold the big ideas. English is a Germanic language, but it's only like 15% of our vocabulary in English. And those are the little tiny everyday words, right? The big words that hold the big ideas come from Latin or French, which come from Latin. So 60% of the words in English come from Latin. So to me, that's like a big, if you want to talk about big ideas and important things, Latin is really helpful. But if you only want to talk about the mundane things with a limited 200-word vocabulary, then sure, English is great.
But yet, so if you want to compare them to the public school, in my town, they start at freshman year, and they're required to have, and every year they're added through, so that by the senior year, they have this binder full of the prefixes, suffixes, that they have to memorize so that they can pass the ACT and SAT. So, I mean, you're preempting all of that.
I can just see your point resonating with a teenager, though. Yeah, if you want to limit yourself to 200 words, go ahead, don't take Latin. Like, I can see that really working well with the teenager.
So I'll jump in here too. These have been very useful in the sense that I was talking about earlier. I sometimes do those, and then I pair it with what I've been talking about with the enjoyment. So learning a language is a cultural experience. You get into the mind of ancient people by learning Latin. You get to see how they thought, how they read. Like when I tell students, yes or no, those aren't really words in classical Latin, their mind is blown. Like that, you're telling me they can't say yes or no? How do they say thank you? I don't know, I guess they were rude, right? But those kind of cultural experiences, that enjoyment of language in itself, right, that you get from learning Latin along with all these benefits, I kind of like to pair those together so that you can both be an enjoyer of language in general and also have these very specific skills of, yes, English has a ton of Latin words in it, so it's very useful to learn it there, and it's useful to learn it to enjoy just language, right? God's gift of language.
What you just shared, the cultural aspect, that was by far my favorite part of learning Latin. And it connects to your comment on how do you get kids to look out beyond themselves. You remind them that the world is older than they are. And learning about an ancient culture, one that you get to connect to the Bible, which is even more exciting, and talking about other things that were going on, before in the days of Jesus, and how all of that connects together, it brings it to life, and it makes it personal for them. And that's the best part of learning Latin. It really is.
Very good. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. This is way more people than I thought would be here, so thank